It's been a real pleasure photographing the annual bonsai show for the past few years. And I already had a passion for it, but never knew a lot about it. And as I got involved and started photographing the trees, started meeting the people, saw the dedication, the patience, the beauty, the art, really, of it. It's been just a great experience and an honor for me. Somebody recently asked me what I know about bonsai trees, and I said very little. Very little. My wife is here with me tonight. For those of you who haven't met her, Laurie. A few weeks ago, she was so mad at me. She said I ruined her birthday, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't even know it was your birthday. I don't know, I didn't get it. You probably heard about the crisis with some of the Japanese banks right now. The Origami Bank has folded. The Sumo Bank has gone belly up, and the Bonsai Bank is cutting several of its branches. So, you know, I always like to start with a little humor. From our friends, maybe you've seen the little place up in Indian Hills that has the famous sign. They actually have their own website. And so before we get going, here's some words of wisdom from the Indian Hills sign up there. Before the crowbar was invented, crows had to drink at home. Local headline, wheel stolen off local police vehicle. Cops are working tirelessly to solve the crime. Tirelessly. If you're cold, all you have to do is go stand in a corner. It's 90 degrees. Ooh, this is a tough crowd tonight. Another local headline, the man who recently fell in the upholstery machine has been recovered. Last one, the problem with political jokes is that sometimes they get elected. And I don't care what side of the fence we're on. We both can agree with that statement. So anyway, when I was asked to do a presentation on photography, obviously I don't talk a lot about bonsai, but I thought for the benefit of everyone, we'd kind of do a little lesson in general photography. For those of you who know all of these things, my apologies, but I think it will benefit, some of the people here. So we all have these in our pockets these days, and they take amazing pictures. The technology in these is mind-boggling, but the problem is you're dealing with a teeny tiny optic and a teeny tiny sensor. And for any of you who have ever tried to really blow up or work with phone pictures, you know that the amount of pixels that are there, the amount of information, and the resolution, it's getting better, but it's still nowhere near a camera with a decent sized sensor and decent sized optics. So as we talk about this, if you ever decide you want to make the investment in a little bit better camera, give you a few tips, a little bit of advice. So first off, let's see if this is working. Oh, my brilliant AV guy set me up with this wonderful little remote here. It's great. So an SLR camera. Now an SLR camera works the same way as film SLR cameras did ages ago. The only difference is instead of constantly changing film, you are putting it onto an image sensor, which stores an amazing amount, depending on the size card you have. I can store thousands of pictures in mine. And what happens with an SLR camera, the image comes in through the lens, and when you're looking through the camera, the image bounces off a mirror, up through a pentad prism, and into the eyepiece, okay? When you take the picture, that mirror quickly lifts up, you can see the little arrow, the image is then projected onto the sensor and goes immediately into the hardware and into whatever storage you're using. So, and the reason I start here is as we talk about some of the different features, some of the different things you can do to get the most out of your photography, it's important to have a basic understanding of how an SLR works. Now, you've also heard the term point-and-shoot camera. And the fancy term for that these days is mirrorless. They've improved the technology to the point where a mirrorless camera has the same level of optics and almost the same level of quality as an SLR. A lot of professional photographers I know have invested in the new mirrorless, but most of them are still using an SLR for special events, weddings, and other types of things. But they're getting very close. But for years, little cameras, just the fun ones you could buy at Walmart or Costco or whatever, you know, or the old point and shoot, still did a great job, but still to this day, the SLR format is considered the best camera format. This is a little picture looking, if you take off the lens, which I'm sure all of you have done at one point or another if you have a SLR or any kind of digital camera, if the mirror is lifted up, which you have to do to be able to see it, if it's an SLR, this is what the sensor looks like in the back of the camera. If you've ever gotten little dust spots on your pictures, it's because every time you take off the lens, there's a little electrostatic charge on the surface of that, and once dust gets in there, it starts showing up in your pictures, especially in a blue sky. I had that problem for years. I do a lot of photography for the Western Airs, equestrian group here, and dusty environments, if I took off that lens, you know, 3 or 4 times during the show, yeah, next time I was doing landscape, oh crap, here's the dust spots, right? So, you know, a little tip if you're changing lenses often, try to do it in really clean environments. Try to avoid doing it when it's dusty. I clean my own sensor. It's a bit of a pain, but it's like 50, 60 bucks to have a sensor clean once you get those dust spots going on it. So there are multiple features on most cameras. You have the standard 4, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. And then a lot of these cameras will have several other features on them, on the little dial or somewhere on top, that are just variations of the 4 I'm going to talk about. The first thing I'm going to talk about tonight is shutter speed. Most people, when they buy a camera, you know, a mirrorless, a point and shoot, an SLR, spend the majority of their time in program or A mode, where the camera looks, you know, through its software inside and says, okay, we have this much light, we have these kind of conditions, this is what I think the best shot's going to be, and it just does it for you, okay? I do some shooting in program mode, but the majority of my shooting is in one of the other 3, which are shutter priority, aperture priority, or full-blown manual priority. So I said I do a lot of shooting for the Western Airs. Well, this is a trick rider at the National Western Stock Show. To get a shot like this, I have to be at about 500 to the second to be able to do that. I can't do that in program mode. I just can't do it. It's just impossible. The camera will not adjust to be able to freeze it the way I need it to. So, and the reason I'm going over some of these modes is to help you do different things with your camera. Sporting events, racing motorcycles or cars, anything with speed involved, get out of program mode and go into shutter priority. Set your shutter speed either for fast to freeze the action, or I'll show you the opposite in just a second to slow it down. So here's another one just for fun. This was out of a window of a van on a recent trip to Vietnam. Now we're driving down the road, they're moving, everything's moving, and I'm shooting out the window trying to capture shots like this. And this was at about, again, 500. I can't remember if this was 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second. Could never get this shot with the phone, could never get it on program mode, okay? Because everything was moving. But how about that for creative? I mean, the scooter culture over there was just absolutely amazing. And don't worry, we're going to be talking about bonsai too. So every shot in here is mine except for 2. On the extreme end of shutter speed, we're talking 10,000th of a second, 20,000th of a second. You can do things like this. Again, impossible unless you've set the camera for that kind of speed. Or even a picture like this. Again, these are the only 2 that aren't mine. I have lots of different examples of pictures where I've used really fast shutter speed, but I just wanted to show you what happens when you're able to adjust how quickly that diaphragm opens in there. We'll talk about the diaphragm in just a moment. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum on shutter speed is to things down. Again, a shot like this, I took this up in the Lost Creek Wilderness. The only way you can do this is to be in shutter priority and go at 2, 3, 4, 5, I believe this was 10 seconds, okay? We've got the waterfall, and we had all of these aspen leaves that had collected in this pond, and in 10 seconds, that was all the movement of water and all those leaves. Absolutely impossible unless you turn into that S mode, okay? Everybody with an SLR or even a point and shoot has that, and you can do this if you just experiment. Now, when we talk about a shot like this, there are 3 things that are absolutely essential for good photography. First of all, a decent camera. Doesn't have to be an expensive camera, but a decent camera with decent optics, right? The second most important thing that you can have is a tripod. Nobody, not the best photographer in the world, can do anything like this or a lot of really specialized shots without a tripod. If you don't have one and you have a good camera, invest in it. The things you can do with it are just incredible. The third thing is to be your own darkroom, is to have a decent photo editing program. Lightroom, Photoshop. I use a program mostly called Photoshop Elements. The full-blown Photoshop is a massive graphics program. It's huge. But they did a photographic version called Elements that just is everything you need to edit your pictures. I love it. I love Lightroom also, but I'm primarily using Elements. So those are the 3 main things you need to do great photography. Here's another time exposure. This was about 8 seconds of a waterfall in Zion National Park. Tripod, shutter mode, set it to 5-10 seconds, whatever you want. Make sure the camera's stable. Then you can get shots like that. All those professional shots you've seen, landscape, with all that beautiful flowing water movement, that's all they're doing. Tripod, shutter priority, long exposure, okay? Again, these kind of shots, you can handhold them, but they are fantastic and much more crisp if you can either brace the camera or, better yet, a tripod. So next up is aperture priority. Aperture priority is my favorite mode by far and away. There's the way the optics in the lens work and the way the little diaphragm that opens inside the lens, I'll show you that in just a moment, it opens to different degrees depending on what we call your f-stop, okay? On a very high f-stop, it opens up to just a tiny little opening, like 1/8 of an inch. On a very low f-stop, it opens up very wide, okay? It does let more light in, but as that diaphragm opens fully, your depth of field becomes much more shallow, okay? So in this example, we have the image out here, the subject. The image is coming in through the lens and through the iris or diaphragm to the sensor. If you have a really fast lens, anything in the 2.8 to 1.4 f-stop range is a very fast lens. Very good optics, okay? This is showing set at f1.4, and that diaphragm opens up all the way. You're only going to get the subject in focus. Everything in front of that, everything behind that will blur. So f-stop is incredible. There's so many things you can do with changing the f-stop from as much as some cameras go up to like f32, very fast lens, f1.4, to get everything in focus or just your subject in focus, okay? Now here's what the diaphragm looks like. This is hidden back inside your lens. Most people never see it. f22, f2.8 or 1.4. So I could go into the scientific reasons why when the diaphragm's fully open, you get a narrower depth of field. But just trust me on those f-stop settings and how much it changes your photograph. Here's what it looks like if you see it when it's closed down in the lens. There's a function on my camera, I can close it and hold it there, and this is what it would look like at a pretty high f-stop. See how tiny the opening is. So, low f-stop. I took this picture just right over next to the tent, one of the shows a couple years ago. All the flowers that are out there and everything. So you can see how the subject is pretty crisp focus, especially for being small. Flowers, pretty crisp focus, but everything in the foreground, everything in the background is a blur. It makes that subject really, really pop. You cannot get that shot to come out like that unless you try that A button and learn how to use it. Aperture priority, okay? Here's another one. Again, it's right next to the tent. Managed to get the eye and some of the facial features of this little guy in focus. Everything else a complete blur. I probably shot this at f2.8, I'm guessing. Again, wildflowers, anything that you want the subject to pop, go with a low f-stop, and that's the effect that you'll get. People are great to shoot at a low f-stop also. Portrait work, get them to really pop against a blurred background, beautiful stuff. Here's one that was from inside the show, trying to get some detail work. Again, it's tricky, especially with a macro lens. The focus and that depth of field point on a macro lens is very touchy. Whenever I'm doing this kind of work, I usually take 2 or 3. It's hard to set up a tripod and walk around the whole show. So I'll do them by hand at a fairly high shutter speed, but I'll take 2 or 3, hoping one will be crisp, because even the tiniest movement with the macro lens and everything's blurred. But you see, I managed to get the wire and a little bit of the leaf in nice focus. I think it makes it, pop nicely. Again, looking for different details, shooting in aperture mode, a little bit of detail looking up under a tree, got some of the wire work, and a lot of blurring on the things that were close up. This little guy was 1/8 of an inch. It's not that big. But that's the kind of things you can do with a macro lens. A standard lens, you can get pretty close, and then with the editing software, you can try to pull it in. But with a macro lens, you can get the detail. I mean, these are like tinier pieces of dust right there. Flower that was right outside the tent. Again, I tried to get the center in focus, and I didn't care what else blurred a little bit. This is the fun stuff you can do in aperture priority. One more that was just right outside the tent. This was a flower in one of the little, I forget what you call the little accents that are sometimes with the trees.
Accent.
Isn't there another name though too?
Well, you may be thinking of Kusama.
That was in one of those little guys under the table, just a teeny tiny little flower like that big. And that's how close you get. Detail right up to the stamen and the pistil. Pretty fun stuff. So on the opposite end, I took this picture up in Rocky Mountain National Park. We've got good detail, good focus on, these are Perry Penstemon, by the way, up close, and we've got reasonably good focus on the peak in the background. This I probably shot at about f22. If I had made a shot like this at f2.8, I'd only have one thing or the other in focus, right? So when you see those really wonderful shots that some of these guys do, like John Fielder or some of those guys, where everything's in focus. You got the wildflowers right here, the peaks in the background. It's one of two things. They're either shooting at an extremely high f-stop, or it's a blended photo. I don't blend my photos. There are software that makes it easy now. But what a lot of these guys do is they'll take 3 or 4 pictures of the same exact spot, using a tripod, of course. They'll do one image to have the foreground in perfect focus and exposure, do another one to have the background, and then they blend them in a photo program. And I can usually tell, and when I walk around some of these galleries, you would not believe the digital magic that goes into some of these pictures. They're not all as they were shot. Here's getting into the next mode. So we have program mode, where the camera thinks for you. We got shutter priority, where you tell it how fast the shutter speed will be. You've got aperture priority, which controls your depth of field and the amount of light that the lens looks in. Then you've got manual mode, where you tell the camera everything. You tell it shutter speed, you tell it ISO, which I'll talk about in just a second, and you tell it the aperture. Pictures like this was when Comet Neowise was over the city. And I went up to Mount Falcon, and I tried it first in just shutter priority, and then I tried it in aperture. They just weren't coming out, so I finally went to manual mode, told the camera exactly what I wanted it to do, and was able to get a picture like that. So that's your fourth mode, is manual mode, where you tell the camera everything. Pictures like this. This was up at a little, you can see I got just a little bit of blur in the city because it was so windy that night. But this is in manual mode, okay, where I told the camera the shutter speed, I told it the aperture, told it everything, and was leaving it open for like 10 seconds at a time, just trying to capture a lightning bolt. Got this one the same night. Again, unfortunately, I got just a little blur down here because it was so windy. Even on a tripod, I couldn't keep the camera 100% stable. But pictures like this are easy if you go to that M mode and have a tripod. You can learn how to do stuff like this. So that, we'll start getting into the bones. Yes, sir?
Well, talk to us for a minute about the adjustments you have to make. Like if you're in aperture mode and you set it for the depth you're talking about, will the camera automatically set the speed?
The camera will automatically set the speed when you're in aperture mode. If you're in shutter priority mode, it will automatically set the aperture. So you're only telling it one of the things that you want it to do.
Right.
Okay? That still doesn't mean that your exposure is going to be good. So what I will often do, if I'm a little concerned with the exposure, the nice thing about these cameras versus the film cameras, you can take a quick look at the picture. If I'm a little bit overexposed or underexposed, I can adjust either the shutter speed or the aperture that fast to change the exposure of the picture. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second.
So you
yes.
And you bracket also, you take 2 or 3.
Yeah, I was going to talk about bracketing in a minute. The camera can do that automatically, or you can do it yourself. So this was the first year that I shot for you guys. And I found out very quickly that the only mode that was working for me was manual. Full-on manual mode. And I tried natural light, I tried all kinds of different settings, but the best pictures were with a strobe. You've seen the strobes with the big umbrellas on them. And I like the strobe because it really made the color in the trees pop and stuff. I changed the background, which you'll see a couple years later. I had some problems with that background. No matter how many times we ironed it, some wrinkles were showing up and had to do a lot of touch-up. But it was trial and error and learning. But all of these were shot manual mode, and you just mentioned bracketing. And what I would do is take each one of these 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5, 6 times, and on each one I would adjust the f-stop one setting. Okay? Let's say my magic point seemed to be, we haven't talked about ISO yet, I'll talk about that in just a second, but my magic point seemed to be an ISO of 320, an f-stop of f8, and a shutter speed of 200th of a second. Okay? That seemed to be kind of the magic point. I've got that memorized now, and that's always where I start. However, no matter where we've set up, conditions change during the day. Sunlight changes. I mean, sometimes we start out and the sun's really bright, or maybe it gets brighter later in the day. It changes everything, okay? So as the day goes on, I'm constantly making adjustments, and I always take, when I go back to do the editing and I go through all these, I always, pick out the best one, and probably 9 times out of 10, there is one that I think is perfect. If I didn't get one that was absolutely perfect, I get the closest one and then make adjustments in the photo editing program, okay? But yeah, each one of these was 2 or 3 different shots, probably starting at about f8, and then bumping up one, bumping down one, because as you change that opening on the diaphragm, you change the amount of light that's coming in. So that's the easiest way to adjust, make it a little brighter or a little darker, okay? And like I said at the beginning, when I started doing this, I'd already loved bonsai trees. And after starting to meet all of you and photographing them, it was just like, oh my gosh, this stuff is amazing. And I couldn't wait to get better at it and, you know, just do the best I could for you guys. So this was the next background. And you could see the gray was nice too, but I didn't have a great tablecloth. I think everybody liked this a little bit better. That more mottled look. It kind of eliminated any chance for wrinkles. I might change that background again sometime. I can't, I don't think I have time this year, but just to give you a whole new look, maybe for next year's. So setting up that background, getting it all hung, getting it all straightened out, trying to protect it from wind. Again, depending on how the sun came in, the background would be kind of dark or kind of light. Constant adjustments. So it's never easy doing this kind of stuff. It'll be easy for a little while. You might have a period of, you know, 10, 20 trees, and the lighting just stayed the same. Bam, 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 bam. Then all of a sudden you're looking and it's like, ooh, this is starting to overexpose. And you look up and you're like, oh yeah, the sun's brighter now. All those outside things can really affect it. I think that's one of the halls.
No.
Oh, that is a church. You have a nice bougainvillea though. Oh, okay. Who's that one?
Oh my God.
Not here? Okay. I love it when they're doing like that. They're so beautiful. As we look at some of these trees, any questions while we're on the trees just a little bit? All right, let's talk about ISO just a little bit. Back in the old days, you put film in your camera. If you were shooting outdoors, you'd probably put 100 ASA in your camera. If you were shooting indoors, you might put 400 or 800 ASA. Well, when we got to the digital world, they just changed the terminology basically to ISO. And just like that, again, program mode does it for you. But if you're doing any of this on your own, it's quick as a snap of your fingers to get into the menu and change the ISO to whatever you want it to be. And that has a big effect on how your picture comes out too. So just remember that ISO, a low number, is for daylight or a lot of light or using a flash. A high number would be for low light. You do have the same problem. They're getting better, but digital sensors have the same problem as film. The higher you go in ISO, my camera will go to 52,000, which is amazing. I can shoot in a cave, but when you get to those high numbers, it gets a little grainy because the sensitivity of the film, or in this case, the digital sensor, is so extreme that it picks up a lot of noise, okay? They are getting better, but I try to avoid, let's say I had a shot in a real dark environment. If I've got my tripod, I'd much rather shoot that shot at, say, 2,000, 3,200, or 4,000 ISO than, say, 12,000, 20,000, because I know if I hand hold it at those, not only will I probably not be able to be steady enough, but I know it'll get a little grainy, okay? So that's where your tripod and knowing how to change that ISO is really, really helpful. The camera, 90% of the time, will just think the ISO for you. In full manual mode, I always set it where I want it based on the lighting conditions. And that's just experience tells me, okay, like in this room right now, if I was shooting you guys, if I was using the tripod, I'd probably go about 1,000 ISO, okay? If I was hand holding it, I'd probably go about 2,500. Because at 2,500, I'll be at a little faster shutter speed and hopefully not blur anything. Just little tips you may or may not, remember. All right, let me take a peek at my notes, make sure I'm not forgetting anything. All right, see if we covered everything so far. All right, we are doing great so far. So backgrounds in photography, when I'm doing weddings and things like that, I've gotten so used to, I don't just see the subject anymore. I always see the background as well. And it's absolutely amazing that sometimes that much can change a whole background and take something you don't want, in the background. Or like sometimes I'll be shooting a couple or a senior picture and I like where they're at, I like the lighting, I like everything, but there's maybe, I didn't notice there was a sign in the background. Well, oh, now it's behind me, okay? learn to kind of pay attention to backgrounds, work with your backgrounds a little bit. Sometimes backgrounds are unavoidable, you know, there's just something you can't get out of there. Or if it's minor, you can touch those kind of things up real easy in the photo editor. I do a little bit of cutting and pasting in mine, where you take, as long as you have a similar look, let's say foliage, that's on one side of the picture, but over a little bit, there's something you want out of it, you can grab little snippets of it and just cover whatever you don't want. It's really slick, really slick. I do that quite often, just to touch things up a little bit. Again, just love the trees. I love the way the strobe brings out the color. Again, tried to shoot the first year I did half. I kept turning the strobe on and off. I would do natural light, then the strobe. Once we looked at them, the strobe brought out so much more color and detail. That's what I've done ever since. Getting into some other tips for photography, there's, you know, everybody is their own artist with the camera, okay? But one of the ones that they teach you in Camera 101 is the rule of thirds. And that is, if you're looking at a shot and you have at least 3 elements in that shot, try to fill the frame equally with all 3 elements. That's all the rule of thirds is. So in this shot, which I took down by Uray, we've got about an equal third sky, about an equal third mountains, and about an equal third to balloon. Balloon's a little less. But you can see how I composed it to put the balloon in its own kind of area, its own third, versus in the center. We tend to always put our subject right in the center, and you know, shooting the trees at a show, it's kind of neat. But when you're out shooting, play with it a little bit. And the nice thing about digital is you can take several and keep your favorite later. But don't always put the subject right in the middle, move it around a little bit. Here's another shot. This is in Canyonlands. I'm a big Ansel Adams fan. This is my attempt at an Ansel Adams kind of shot. But you can see I got about a third rock, about a third sky, and about a third the dead tree. And composed it with that thought in mind as I took the picture. Yeah?
I have a bunch of Ansel Adams in my house, and I think that's exactly what I thought when I saw it.
And that is not an easy spot to get to. We've got that one framed in our hallway. It's called Druid Arch. And it's a tough hike, but if you're ever in the Needles District of Canyonlands, which is one of the finest hiking parks in the whole national park system, Druid Arch is an amazing journey. I had to give my wife a little plug here. So we do some pretty wild things together. This is in Europe, in Switzerland. This is the Lauterbrunnen Valley down here, and we're on a thing over there that they call Ferrata. Which translates to Iron Way. They built them in the First World War, the Italians did, to avoid and hide things should the Germans have advanced on Italy. They weren't allies in World War I. And it became a sport, and now they have these things everywhere. And so you clip into this cable, and as long as you're clipped in, you're safe. She is standing over about 2,000 feet there. I didn't tell her this was in there. You forget me? Okay. More fun things you can do with photography. This is done with a fisheye lens. It's fun to pick up a few different lenses. Obviously, you should have a lens that's versatile for, just your basic environment. Maybe about a 50 millimeter, or maybe like an 18 to like 75 zoom, something like that. It's also really nice to have a telephoto if you're looking for longer, bringing in something like wildlife or things that are distant, or you can have a zoom that covers you up to 200, maybe even some, they can start getting expensive if you're talking a zoom up to 300. Another fun lens is a fisheye. I'm just standing in that aspen grove, looking up like this, and it took all that in just beautifully. So a fisheye is a fun way to play around a little bit, as is the macro. Okay? Another way to play around and have a little fun is your camera will have 4 or 5 different color modes. Some have as many as 10. Yes, you can convert to black and white in your photo editing program. However, when it converts, it looks at that image and it changes and deletes millions of pixels, okay? Millions to turn it into black and white. It's taking all those color pixels and it's judging them on a grayscale, and you actually degrade the photo considerably when you convert it into program. So I constantly go to sepia tone or black and white if I think it's a shot that will look cool in that format. And when you shoot that way, you look for things that would be dramatic in black and white. Somebody's face, something like this. I just was watching her play. This was a couple years ago. We had that wonderful artist there. And I just thought, I like that shot better in black and white. And so play with those settings. Play with your camera. Try some black and white shots. This was in the Vatican Museum. I saw her. This was a Bernini statue that never got finished. And I looked at that, and it was kind of a red wall behind her. And I said, no. This is a black and white shot. Take 2 seconds, change it to black and white, and it was perfect. Absolutely perfect. I'm just showing you these to give you, some creative juices, okay?
Mike?
Yes?
Are you going to talk about color balance, what that is and how to use it?
Who can tell me what is the most difficult color to get right?
White. That's all I know.
You get my first door prize. I made these bonsai cards a couple years ago. Might as well give 2 away while I'm at it.
Who made it?
Well, my wife and I. She's my card-making assembly person. She's wonderful. Sorry. That should say made by Lori. Okay, who am I? I don't have a bonsai question at the moment, but here's one. Who won Comeback Player of the Year last night at the ESPN Awards? Jamal Murray, coming back from that horrible ACL and key to our NBA championship. Anybody watch some games? No? Not an NBA crowd. But it was a great moment. 47 years we waited. So I'll talk about color balance just for a second. Everything the camera does is based off of white balance, okay? If you're in an environment where you're super concerned about getting the color balance just right on, then you want to get a balance, I can't remember the technical term, but they make these little cards that have pure white, pure red, pure yellow, all the different colors on them, and you take a picture of it, and then you tell the camera, okay, this is white under this lighting, okay? This is white under, or this is red under this lighting, or this is blue. And then the camera adjusts everything based on that lighting, okay? But it's all mostly based on white. And white changes depending on incandescent, fluorescent, LEDs, etc. The basic white balance is formatted off sunlight, okay? Outdoor, pure white. But that white changes everywhere you go. I don't use that white balance card very often. I have on occasion. The camera has an auto white balance setting on it that is generally very accurate. Sometimes later on, if I feel like the tone's just slightly off on the picture, in my photo editing program, one of the functions I have is I can point at any point of that picture, tell the photo editing program, this was white, and it'll adjust the whole picture based on that. Just like that.
Is that independent of aperture mode, shutter mode,
Absolutely
ISO,
independent.
all that stuff? So that's
Absolutely.
a separate setting.
Yeah. Yeah, completely separate. And aperture mode, shutter mode, it doesn't matter what mode you're in, the white balance is the same for all of them. White is white. So I can tell you one of the biggest challenges at an outdoor wedding, since now that we know white is the most difficult color, oh my gosh, a bright, sunny outdoor wedding, you can guess what's the most difficult thing to get right?
The bride's
The
dress.
dress.
The dress.
The dress. Oh my gosh. And so if you get the dress perfect, a lot of times everybody else is going to be dark, especially if they're wearing dark colors and things. If you overexpose the dress to get everybody else just right, then you wash out any details in the dress. Very tricky. One of the trickiest things in photography is an outdoor wedding with a bright, big white dress. So anyway, back to trying to be a little bit creative. I thought this was, it was a great color picture, but the light was getting so low at that point in the evening, I said, I think it'd be a fun black and white picture. So I switched the camera over and decided to do a couple in black and white. It also gives you variety in your portfolio. You know, like when I turn my pictures over to David and Paul, I don't want them to see the same things over and over again. I want them to occasionally see a picture that's like, oh, that's kind of cool, you know, have a little fun with it. Things like this, light, shadows, and just looking for just fun little things. You know, I'm always walking around. One of my rules is I look for the big and the small, the short and the tall. I try to stay, I mean, a lot of your pictures are right here, but what about down here? What about up there? There's things all around you that are beautiful, that are interesting. Be an artist with the camera, you know. I have no ability to draw or paint or any of those things, but with the camera I can be pretty creative. But I still miss things. I see people take shots that I just go, holy smokes, I never saw that. Again, looking for some details. Who can tell me if that was a low or high aperture shot?
Low.
Low.
Who said low first? That was shot at probably about 2.8. Okay? Very low aperture setting, very shallow depth of field, intentional to get a little detail here and blur out all the people and everything in the background. Okay? That was very, when you do a shot like that, if you know how to use those, you know, those 4 settings, program, shutter, aperture, and manual, you can see in your mind already what the picture will look at. I saw that picture in my mind before I ever looked at it when I got it home. I said, when it came up, I was like, perfect, exactly what I wanted. Things like this, little details. I think this was a David Peters tribute, I believe. All those wonderful air roots. I was like, I mean, I took a bunch of pictures of it where you could see the whole tree roots, and I thought, you want to zoom in for a moment, just kind of get some detail of those. Experiment, have fun. Again, the worst thing that can happen is you delete, right? Again, low aperture, wanted to get the accent in focus, blur everything in the background. I thought, just looking, you know, when you really start looking, you look for more than the obvious shot, look under things, around things. I saw that little guy that somebody, there's probably a term for that, to protect that branch. I thought, how cool is that? Look at the patience, the effort, the time you guys put into this stuff, you know? And just things maybe other people wouldn't notice or see. The tiny wires going all the way up to the very tips of some of these branches. I mean, it just blows my mind when I walk around and look at some of this stuff. Look for patterns. Patterns are everywhere. Patterns, there's human patterns, there's nature's patterns. Architecture photography. If you're ever doing architecture, look for different lines in the architecture. Take the same shot 5 or 6 times and take each one off a different line in the architecture, okay? Pick different spots, different lines, and one of them will come back and you'll go, oh my, that's fantastic. Like shooting downtown at the art museum, oh my God, you can't believe the stuff you can get around there by not taking the straight on shot. Pick this angle, okay? This arch goes this way, take that angle. Just experiment, have fun with that camera. That's what these things are all about. Okay, photo editing programs. I showed you that shot once earlier. Well, you can have all kinds of fun and create some really neat things. Like this could be one bonsai tree in the center and a whole bunch around. It could be anything you want it to be, and any pattern you want it to be. I created this one entirely myself. For years, I've been taking pictures of individual aspen leaves. It just blows my mind how different they turn in the fall, the different patterns they make. So I put this all together. It took me, oh my God, it took me hours. But I finally took all my shots from over the years from different places, all my favorites, created a border, put that one in the center. All with your little, you know, this was with Photoshop elements. You do it in Lightroom too. Again, have fun there also. Okay, here was a pretty standard picture of a beautiful tree taken at the show. And I decided to play around a little bit. In those photo editing programs, there's all kinds of little artsy things you can do to pictures. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. There's one way. There's another way. It almost makes it look like a painting or a sketch, you know? And there's another way. Again, you've got so many ways. Once you know all those functions on the camera, and once you have good photo editing software and play around with it, there's so many things you can create. They have this, in mine, it has this whole group of different effects under sketch. And I tried like 6 of them. Ugly, 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 ugly. And I can't remember which one this was. I think it was charcoal. And I was like, oh, bam, I love it. You could put that on a business card, you know, whatever. Here's another one, just playing with some of the effects. Again, I'm showing you these to hopefully get the creative juices flowing for all the different things you can do with the camera and the photo editing. Here's another one. This just had just a touch of artsy photo editing to it, just to kind of just blur things, soften things just a little bit. Just gave it kind of a neat effect, I thought. Let's see. Oh, here, I jumped to that one before I told you about another several other interesting features on your camera. If you've got a nice point and shoot, even the phones do it, especially if you've got a nice mirrorless or SLR, is time lapse, okay? If you put that camera in a tripod, put it in time lapse mode, you can tell it how often to take a picture and for how long, okay? Let's say you want to go every 5 seconds for 20 minutes. That's a fantastic setting for a storm. I do a little bit of storm chasing, and you can watch the cloud development and the motion. Oh, it's just fantastic. This one took all night. This Easter lily cactus made those beautiful blooms that open once. And when I knew it was imminent and they opened at night, I got the lighting the way I wanted it. I set the camera up in the tripod and did one every 5 minutes all night long to get that time lapse you just saw. Here we go.
So are you hitting the shutter every 5 minutes, or that's an automatic setting that just does it by itself? You can take a nap.
Oh, let me mouse over to it right now because we're in the thing. It took a picture all by itself every 5 minutes, all through the night. And so every once in a while, it would, it would just be like the first 6 hours, I think it didn't even change. And then finally, start doing. Time lapse. We talked about bracketing, okay? Taking 3 or 4 shots, but changing the settings ever so slightly to get just that perfect exposure. There's also a bracketing setting in most of these cameras where it will take 3 shots in a row, or 4 or 5, or whatever you tell it. Each one will be just a slightly different setting, okay? And then we just keep the one that came out perfect. Great. And there's infinitely more options inside these cameras also. I think that was it. Yeah, I was saving that one for last. I think I've covered everything I wanted to. What do we have in the way of questions? Yes, sir.
Could you describe what a picture blown up, taken with a high-quality cell phone, like an Apple 16 or something like that, blown up that size, how would it look?
Most of the phone pictures I've seen blown up to anything larger than 11 by 14 start to lose resolution. They're getting there, and that's staggering, really, when you think about a lens that big and a sensor about that big, right?
So it just breaks down the spaces in between the pixels?
Exactly. You just don't get as much information.
Yeah.
Okay. When you're talking optics, this is not a super expensive or fast lens, but you can see how big the glass is in there. 20, 30 times that little tiny. So you're pulling in far more information, and you're also talking a sensor that's, 2 inches, almost 2 by 2 inches wide versus, so it's just the amount of information. So
what's the maximum size you can blow it up to with a cell phone camera? You still have good resolution.
If you want decent resolution, I'd say 11 by 14. I think as you get to like 20 by 30 inches, you can start to really tell. If I go, and I should also mention there are different ways you can store images in these cameras. You've got RAW, you've got JPEG, you've got TIFF, you've got all these different ways. I can save all 3 different types all at once. I chew up space quickly. The difference is RAW gathers the most information. I shoot some things in RAW if it's a really special picture that I really want to work with. But I also shoot probably half the time in just full quality, high quality JPEG. They're easy, quick to work with, and I can blow up a JPEG off of this to 60 by 40, even larger. If I go to TIFF actually is the largest of all. They're like 50 megabyte files. In fact, I can go to 100 megabyte files for a single picture. I could blow up a whole wall of crisp picture of anything I want to shoot. So it's just the amount of information, the amount of pixels that you're gathering, quality of the optics. Again, cell phones, pretty darn good, but you really start to notice it when you get into photo editing programs and you try to either crop or, like I said, make enlargement. I can take one of my pictures with this camera and I can crop to just a quarter of what that original picture was. So I'm losing all that rest of that information, but I just want that little corner for some reason, and I can still easily make it probably a 40 by 60 and have it crisp. So, other questions? Sir?
Is there a camera and a lens that you would recommend specifically for photo?
Everybody right now is putting out a pretty darn good product. You know, Canon and Nikon were leading the way for a long time, but Fuji has come an amazing long way. I mean, there's several models out there. I saw a deal the other day at a B&H camera. It was a Canon something 7. I can't remember the designation now. 2 lenses, a case, extra batteries, decent body for $500. And I was just like, fantastic deal. I mean, as technology has improved, you know, obviously prices will slowly stabilize and come down a little bit. I got into Nikon, and once you pick a particular brand, it's hard to change after that because lenses aren't interchangeable. So I've got several different lenses. If I went and bought a Canon, they do make an adapter, you know, to put a Nikon lens on a Canon or vice versa. But the trouble is that adapter changes some things, and they don't talk as good as, you know, the lens doesn't talk as well with the camera as it did the original, you know. I'm not explaining that well. A Canon lens does not talk to a Nikon body the same way it does to its own, you know, okay. You can do it, but I don't recommend it. But once you start, stick with somebody. Fuji, Canon, Nikon, they're all fantastic. Just find a great deal. You know, shop around, find a great deal. Sir?
So on the photos that you had of the waterfall and the aspen leaves, you said you kept your exposure open for quite a long time. How did that image not get washed out?
When you shoot a long time exposure, you set the, like on a picture like that, I'll have my ISO very low, meaning it takes longer to expose, okay? If I try to shot like that with a real high ISO, like 5,000 or something, I'd wash it out like that. So you're at a very low ISO. You're opening your aperture very small, so you don't let as much light in. And also, on some of those, I added what was called a neutral density filter, okay? And what a neutral density filter does is it doesn't change anything about the image, it just makes it look darker to the camera. And so you can expose longer, right? And they make these neutral density filters in different stages. There's a 2 times, a 4 times, an 8 times, a 16 times. With a 16 times, you'll make it 16 times darker than what it actually is. So you could be in bright sunlight and all of a sudden the camera thinks it's really dark. And so you can keep the lens open for, or the shutter open for, you know, 10, 15, 20 seconds. I believe that one aspen leaf where they were all swirling, I believe that was 15 seconds, if I remember correctly. So real light, low ISO, and I didn't have the aperture open very wide. And it was also in a shady spot, which helped a lot. Doing waterfalls and things like that is tricky when you're in direct sunlight, unless you've got a neutral density filter. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that the JPEG kind of filters out some information versus the RAW. I was just wondering what it filters out.
Well, RAW has, if I remember correctly, nearly 80 different color pixels that it will store. JPEG has, I think, about half of that. So it stores more color information. It's also a much larger file. So, but working with RAW is a little bit tricky, but it is, one thing that's nice about RAW, when you edit a RAW photo, that you never change the original. You do all the editing you want, you can always go back to exactly like it was shot, right? After you're done editing it the way you like, then you resave it as a TIFF or a JPEG or whatever, but the original will always stay the same. So again, it all depends on what I'm shooting, but they take up a lot of space. They're a little bit tricky to work with sometimes, so sometimes I just fly and shoot a JPEG.
And does a JPEG, is it optimized for like how humans interpret the colors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? Ma'am?
Excuse me. I look at a lot of your photographs because I put them on our website for our
Well,
newsletter.
thank you, ma'am.
And you have the great advantage because you have a great background. And we just had this show, we had trees out in the bonsai pavilion, and we take pictures of trees in people's backyards or anywhere, and there's a lot of greenery in the background sometimes. It's very distracting, or something is going on. I'm assuming with a cell phone, if you put it in portrait mode, that might eliminate some of that background because you're getting a smaller f-stop. But, I mean, how can we help take photographs of bonsai without all that distraction?
It's very difficult sometimes. If the subject has a background that's a similar color, you know, it's like when I do senior pictures of kids. If they're shooting in a park, I tell them don't wear green, right? Or things like that. But if there's no way around it, you can either do like a little, portable backdrop, or if you're in aperture priority and, the low f-stop, and blur that background a little bit, that'll get it to pop a little bit more, so it won't get lost. And I was going to tell you before, these cameras that have 30 extra settings, like they'll have a little flower for macro, or a little guy running for sports mode, and all that kind of stuff. All that's doing is the same thing I explained to you. It's just going to shutter mode, or aperture mode, or whatever. I don't touch any of those additional buttons, because I know how to do it myself. And now, you guys know how to do it yourself, right? Depending on the camera. And you can still use those, and they're fun to work with, but no, stick in those four that I told you about, if you can. But backgrounds are tricky when you have the same color or a busy background. And even I would struggle with just attention. Sometimes a flash could make a difference. We talked about, I do the trees for the show, the strobe. A lot of SLRs, a lot of point and shoots, and even some mirrorless have a little flash attached. Some do not. I could not do the events that I do without an external flash. Weddings, even some of the stuff around the show, like things we can't fit in the booth that I've got to go shoot out on the show floor. I mean, they're too big or too heavy. The flash makes a huge difference. Popping the colors, getting it to stand out a little bit more. So sometimes those might pop a little bit more. If there's a little distance between that subject and the background, you'll get that flat, to pop a little bit with the flash and not so much in the background. So that's another option for those kind of situations. Sir?
Mike, when you hold up that flash right there and you use the term external flash.
Yes.
That attaches to the camera body. Is
Yes.
that still considered an external flash?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, still considered an external.
And a slave is just unattached to anything. It's triggered by the original flash.
The strobe that I use at the show,
Yes.
that is wired directly into the camera with a cable.
Oh, that's cable.
I have all these little additional, and many of your cameras that you have will have little extra ports on them for different things. I have 4 or 5 different ones on here. I can attach an HDMI. I got one for, so I can do remote stuff. I could have the camera set up over here to not scare wildlife while I'm, way back here with something like this to take a picture. There's all sorts of things. There's things I've never touched or used on this camera. Embarrassingly. Ma'am?
But if you're outside,
Yeah.
you don't have anything to bounce the light off of, so would you point the flash directly at the subject?
Or a slight angle. Some of these, you can
Okay.
angle it a little bit.
Yeah.
Or this has got, a couple other little features. This little guy softens the flash just a little bit, or it pops up this little white card that you can bounce a little off of that. I also have 2 or 3 different pieces that will go over the flash to soften it a little bit, little tints, so to speak.
Diffuser?
Yeah, diffuser basically, and it just softens the flash a little bit. I've used that in some of the close-up shots that I do of the trees. I'll have that on there, just to pop a little extra light on, if it's a little dark or I'm trying to shoot or something. Sir?
So if you're thinking about getting a DSLR camera, there's, kind of a spectrum from, I don't know, it seems like 400 to 5,000.
Yep.
Are there key features that you'd look for, or things you'd say, it should have X, Y, or Z if it's gonna be something that would have some runway? Like, I would want to get one and then 2 years later be like, I should.
Absolutely. I would take a look at one. Another thing that's really cool that these will do is they'll do burst photography for like sports and things like that. And I use that remember I showed you that trick rider? I'll do burst photography for that. I would go for a camera that does a minimum of 6 frames per second on burst. Because what that indicates is it's got a really efficient, fast mirror system. Okay, because every one of those bursts, that mirror's going up and down. You've probably, let's say, you've probably seen guys doing this. Let's say I'm taking this picture right here. This will do 12 frames per second. And so if I'm shooting a sporting event and I'm at a real high shutter speed, like 1,000th of a second, I've got enough light, and I'm panning, let's say it's a car racing by or one of those trick riders, without a doubt, at least one will come out perfectly crisp, right? So that's a great mode, but make sure it can do at least 6 frames per second. Make sure you're looking at least 12 megapixels or larger on the sensor. Make sure it's coming, with at least a decent lens to start with. And honestly, as soon as you're 500 and up, you're going to get a pretty good camera. Like I said, that Canon I saw recently on sale at B&H, that was a terrific camera for, I think, $549, 2 lenses, extra batteries, case. As soon as you start climbing up from there, yes, you'll start getting more, a little bit higher quality, a little bit more features. You might get up to, 10 to 12 on the speed photography. You might get up to 16, even 20 megapixel sensors now, give you a little bit more information. But you don't have to spend a bundle. And anything from about that range up, about 500 up, will have all 4 modes that we talked about to play with and have some fun with. They may have other things on there too, all those little other buttons I told you about, but they're all just playing with those same basic 4 things. That's all they're doing. So learn those 4 and you won't even have to touch the other buttons. So, anybody else? Sir?
Do most new cameras have manuals online? Because you don't get a manual with anything anymore. How far back do you think I can go like an XLM, which I have, it's probably 10, 12 years old. Do you think there's a manual online?
Oh, sure. I've found a manual for everything online.
Oh, really?
Everything. I don't care if it's a refrigerator, a stove, a camera. There's somebody's got it. You can download it in PDF.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, a little poking around, I'm almost sure you can find it.
Cool.
I don't know about a 59 sewing machine.
No,
You found it?
yeah.
You found a 59 sewing? Okay, all right. That's getting pretty old. Wait, that's not born. Anybody else? Okay, I got one final prize for the night, and this is a full box of cards. Okay. Who can tell me, in manual mode, what are the 4 different things that you can control? There's 4 things that you can control completely on your own, if you go into full manual mode. Anybody want to give it a whirl?
Sure. Speed, aperture, shutter speed.
Shutter speed, got that, aperture.
Aperture. Depth of focus is aperture, right? So I can't think of the 2.
The ISO.
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 That's what you just said. Oh, I thought he had 3. That was the 4th.
You had aperture, shutter, you got ISO.
Yeah.
If you said ISO, what's the final one?
Full manual.
He said 4 man.
Oh, full manual mode, there's a 4th thing you can control.
The white balance?
The F-stone?
No.
That's your.
This one's so obvious, it's painful. Camera usually does it by itself.
Focus.
Who said that?
Oh.
So 4 things Now, to do that, we didn't talk about that, so that was an excellent guess. To do that, all these cameras have an autofocus or a manual focus, right? And if you're doing something that's critical on movement or anything, like a lot of times on the trees, once I got it focused just the way I want it, I go to manual focus at that point so that it's not going to change a thing as I take my 4 bracket shots. Or if I'm shooting stars or anything where the slightest bit of movement can change it, even that camera focusing can leave a tiny vibration there. Everything's manual, including the focus. So very good, very good. You have been fabulous. Hopefully everybody took something that'll help them.